When I can get Book of Mormon geography to Excel rather than Word, now we're cooking with gas. But after 21 editions, I have the ability to audit a model in an Excel spreadsheet. If you take every place where there's an up, a down, a north, a south, east, a west, a day's journey, or a crossover, those appear 229 times in the text. Now, suppose you could come up with a model that matches all 229 of those relationships. Should we pay attention to that model?
Did you do it?
Yes. What would I ask of a Wayne May and a John Lefgren and a Jonathan Neville and a Boyd Tuttle and a Ryan Nielsen? I'd say, show me from the text how the Mississippi could possibly be the Sidon.
Oi! The long-awaited part 2 of the Kirk Magleby interview is here.
And if you hadn't watched part 1 yet, you gotta watch it. And in that, he kind of explains his origin story, why he believes the Book of Mormon happened in Mesoamerica. He explains that he believes that Joseph Smith left it open for interpretation for it to happen in Central America. Then we brought on Jonathan Neville, who believes completely different than Kirk Magleby. So now you can weigh those back and forth. And now we are finishing part 2 of the first interview we did with Kirk Magleby, and he's gonna kind of dive into more of the methodology of why he believes Mesoamerica is a good setting for Book of Mormon geography.
And another quick reminder, if you haven't followed us yet on Instagram, please do so at The Sick of Joseph, where you'll find a bunch of epic content that you won't find here. Enjoy the interview.
Should this text be taken at face value? Well, there's many places in the text itself where it basically says plainness. And it says, it uses terminology that indicates that this is supposed to be easy for people to understand. And so that would lead us to believe that maybe we just ought to be taking this thing at face value, more of a literalistic kind of an interpretation. But it's very important that we actually have a perspective of boots on the ground as we do Book of Mormon geography. Of course. Because we are so used to maps this day and age, and we have accurate maps, and we know that this is where Maine sits, and here's where Florida is, and this is where Veracruz fits, and so forth. Here's the Gulf of Mexico. People back in the time period of Mormon and Moroni did not have those sorts of big, huge
Maps.
views. They were looking at stuff from just walking
Their
around.
perspective,
So here's a good point. You go.
Which changes everything, really, because, I mean, even today, with as good as Google Earth is, when we went to Saudi Arabia a few months ago, we had ideas of what the terrain looked like and what it would be like.
And we're like, that's not passable.
We're like, that doesn't look passable. And then you get down there and you're like, oh, this is totally passable. You know what I mean? And so I think it is important to think through that perspective.
This is an interesting little thing that I've always quite liked. Okay, so let's think through what's going on here. This is Ether chapter 10, verse 20. And they built a great city by the narrow neck of land, by the place where the sea divides the land. By this place where the sea divides the land. Now, if you are looking at a big map,
What does that even mean?
where would you put the place where the sea divides the land? I can't tell you how many people have looked at a map and said, well, the Atlantic Ocean divides Florida from Maine. So maybe that's where the sea divides the land. The Gulf of Mexico divides Veracruz from Yucatan. So maybe that's where the sea divides the land. Would anybody who had a boots on the ground point of view ever say something like that?
No, I think
not even close.
I think very much it's like for example, the Red Sea. You can be standing in Jordan, in Aqaba, and you can see Egypt on the other side, and you would say the sea divides those lands. Kind of more like that.
But it would have to be that little inlet of the Red Sea that goes all the way up to the Gulf of Aqaba up there for you to be able to see across it. Otherwise, the Red Sea's too long, and you never notice it. But no, if you're walking along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, would you ever say this is where the sea divides the land? No, never in a million years. So I was in Guatemala City years ago, and there was a really tremendous fellow. He's now getting up there in years, but his name is Rolando Amato, and he was an agronomist, and he met me in my hotel, and he came in and he said, Kirk, there's one place I know where it is. He said, it's this. I know where the sea divides the land. Because he said, I, in my professional career, have walked every single bit of the shoreline of Mesoamerica, from Mexico to Guatemala to Belize to Honduras.
Every single bit.
He says, I've been across every single bit of that. And he said, there's one place where the sea divides the land.
Where's that?
And he said, it's the inlet or outlet of Mar Muerto on the border between Oaxaca and Chiapas, right off the coast of Tonalá, Mexico.
Okay. And is there just like a big inlet, like a big kind of gulf? I can't picture it right now.
Well, what you've got is the Pacific Ocean,
Okay.
sandbars, some big lagoons on the landward side of the sandbars, and then an outlet where these sandbars break out, and that's where the inlet outlet is. This is where the water is coming and going between the ocean and the estuary. Yep. And that was exactly the place I had pinpointed as the place where the sea divides the land. But he comes in and says, I know that's the place because I've walked every other possibility, and that's the only place that makes sense. That's point of view, that's boots on the ground, okay? We have to use that kind of thinking if we're going to actually see through the eyes of Mormon and Moroni of what they were seeing. And then it's important to understand what clauses are doing, and this is what Royal Scouts helped us understand. A yea clause, there are plenty of yea clauses in here, okay?
Yeah.
Well, a yea clause explicates the previous clause. So it's giving us more information about the previous clause. It's not breaking new ground. We're not going to talk about a completely new subject here.
Okay. So anytime it says yea, it's almost like a semicolon.
It's almost like a semicolon. Okay. All right? And that becomes very important in the way that we're going to interpret certain passages in this text, okay?
Okay.
And then we have or clauses which supersede the previous clause. And so that's a case where Mormon or Moroni or whoever was the actual engraver at that time, he's going along and says, oh, whoops, I just made a mistake. Or, and then he writes in what he should have said, okay? So the or clause supersedes the previous clause.
Okay.
So those are assumptions about the text. Now, a bunch more assumptions. Suppose that something only shows up once. Can I still use it in my analysis, okay? And we say, yeah, the answer is yes. A single attestation still applies. What about double definitions? Can we ever have two of something? Let me show you something very curious here. So this is the 1981 edition, all right? Now we go back to the topical guide in the 1981 edition, and we look up for the city of Aaron, which is a city in the Book of Mormon. A-A-R-O-N.
Aaron.
Aaron. All right. Look what it says.
Possibly two different cities.
That I was just about to bring that up because how many cities of Washington exist? How many cities of whatever? Like there's
So many. Springfield.
Springfield. Yeah.
Everywhere has a Springfield.
All right. There's another one in here that has the exact same situation. So we go over here to the city of Nephi. All right. And city of, possibly two cities by this name.
Okay.
The reason is because there are some things in the text of the Book of Mormon that lead some modelers to say, this doesn't work very well, but I could solve my problem if there's two of them.
Yeah.
So there was enough of that going on. Now, where do these little notes come from? They come from Orson Pratt, 1879, okay? So he was the guy that put verses, chapters and verses that we have in here. But he also put in the very best information he had at the time that helps us understand what's going on in this text.
So a question with that, because there just seems to be like there could be because you're talking about 1,000 years. Now let's just play not the devil's advocate, but let's jump into maybe Joseph Smith's thoughts and the thoughts of everyone else right when the Book of Mormon came out. Hemispheric model started in Chile, ended up in New York, right? So is there any way that Mormon, who is 1,000 years from when Lehi and his family landed, like everything, like the narrow neck of land, could there be two narrow neck of lands? Is that possible? Like how are you determining, how is that being determined of what could be two different actual locations or what has to be the same location the whole 1,000 years of Book of Mormon takes place?
We are making the assumption that there are no double definitions.
Okay, so there's no double definition.
There's one narrow neck of land, there's one seat of Aaron, there's one seat of Nephi.
Okay, so that's what you're saying.
So what we're basically saying is, if your solution requires a double definition, that there be two of one thing with the very same name, we believe that you need to work a little harder and sharpen your pencil and go back to the drawing boards and refine your model.
Repent.
That's the thing that's so hard about that. Like, But what if the answer is there is a double definition?
Well,
you know what I mean? Like that's what's so difficult.
That's a wild card that absolutely could blow us out of the water.
It could blow you out of the water. Yeah. And that's what's so difficult because, like, for example, the city of Nephi. Is it the same city of Nephi all the way through, like talking about George Washington,
well,
right?
we think it probably is. And here's the reason. Because we have things that get rebuilt right after the destruction through Nephi 8. Mm-hmm. And clear at the end of the Book of Mormon, when Mormon is being brought by his father from the land northward down into the land of Zarahemla. Mm-hmm. The land of Zarahemla is right on the side of the Sidon River, exactly where it was back in the earliest days. Okay. And so there seems to be enough continuity between the pre-destruction geography and the stuff that's happening there towards the latter end. But we see no compelling reason in the text to say, no, there had to be two of these, or this was totally changed around.
And I understand why you have to do this. Like, you have to set ground rules, and when it comes down to it, that's the most solid ground rule you could set, is that there's got to be one of everything.
It's probably the best assumption. And in some cases, we just have to go say, Occam's razor. Mm-hmm. What's most likely to be correct, or the simplest explanation is probably the correct one. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we go down and we say we absolutely are not going to allow a contradictory reading. Mm-hmm. So if there's something that the text explicitly states, you cannot contradict that. Okay. That's going to be an assumption. Then we cannot have a false attribution or a forced reading. Okay. Now, here's a good example of a forced reading. We go into Alma chapter 43. And this is the episode when Zarahemna, and we've got the Amalekites coming on board here, and they go up to and they're going to try to go take over Jershon. Mm-hmm. They're scared because Moroni has equipped the Nephites at Jershon with thick clothing and with some armaments, mm-hmm. and this is the first time the personal armor, protective gear, is now coming on the scene. Mm-hmm. And so in verse 25, Moroni leaves a part of his army in the land of Jershon, and then he takes the rest of his army and he consults with the prophet. And the prophet says they're going to go down and try to take over Manti, which is the extreme southern end of Nephite lands. And so we go down here and we go into verse 32, and so down into the borders of the land of Manti. So we have Captain Moroni, who takes a portion of his army, goes all the way from Jershon, which is in the northeastern part of Nephite lands, mm-hmm. to the south central part of Nephite lands, and he stations his army on either side of the River Sidon, mm-hmm. in the wilderness south of Manti, and from his position, you could go down into the borders of Manti. So it's clear that we're upstream, we're upriver from the borders of Manti. Mm-hmm. So that means if your river is flowing north, that means you're south of the river. If your river is flowing south, that means you're north of the river. But anyway, this is to go in here and try to take Jershon in verse 25 and match it up with Manti in verse 32 is a forced reading. Okay. And you'll hear this from certain people who want to make the
then the same city?
Is that no, they're not trying to make them the same city, but they know that Jershon is in the northern part of Nephite affairs, and Manti is in the southern part of Nephite affairs. And so they say we're going from Jershon down to Manti, mm-hmm. and therefore we're going from north to south, going down, therefore the Sidon River is flowing south. Okay. So this is the one place in the text where people who are trying to get their Sidon to flow south find a little bit of help, but they're misreading the text. Okay. Because there's all this other stuff in between which they're not taking into account. Mm-hmm. And this is what a textual analyst calls a forced reading, mm-hmm. where you're going to say this plus this equals this, and it doesn't, because that's not what it's talking about.
There are other variables.
Because there's a whole ton of variables in the middle that is what it's talking about, and they are completely being skipped over by somebody who's trying to prove their point. Mm-hmm. That's a forced reading, okay? You'll find the forced reading exists for people who are trying to prove a particular point. Mm-hmm. Now, there's another famous forced reading, and that is where John Sorensen goes in, and he goes to Alma chapter 62, and he tries to combine a whole bunch of stuff all together in one 24-hour period. And he then comes back and says, all right, this proves that the East Coast was really short. And therefore, we have this tradition that begins to establish itself in Book of Mormon geography of a short East Coast and a big, long West Coast.
Okay.
That's coming from a forced reading. And I called John on this.
Yeah.
At one point, John, you're misinterpreting this text. And he says, I know, but so many other things work well.
If this works.
If this is the way we read this text, that I'm willing to commit
line.
this one error.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I've heard that, where you get a modeler who goes in, they say, this contradicts what the text says. I know this is not the right way to read this particular text, but I'm going to force my way into this reading because it makes my model work.
But wouldn't that fit the model of what you're talking about earlier in terms of seeing the scattered data sets and then finding the line that fits most of them, but there's still going to be outliers? Can that not exist? Isn't that kind of what he's saying, is that this may be one of those outliers that
well, but what we're saying is that as you go in and read the text, you have to let the text speak for itself. You can't go force a preconceived notion on the way you interpret this text.
Yeah,
that's what
you mean.
What forced reading means.
Okay, cool.
And I'll show you in a minute how we've tried to control for this. But anyway, so what we're saying is there are no forced readings, no false attributions. You've got to let the text speak for itself. And then another famous thing is when people say, well, the text never says this, so I will say, so we can go ahead and say this. That is where we're coming to a conclusion based on what we call a lacuna. A lacuna in a text is simply a gap. It's something it doesn't
say anything about.
It's just an empty place. You cannot go in there and say, because the text doesn't say this, we will say that this could have happened, or this is a relationship that did exist, because the text never contradicts it.
Yeah.
What we're saying is, don't base conclusions on lacunae, because that is not a faithful way to read this text.
Yeah.
Go ahead and try to read between the lines, try to interpret inferences, try to get as much deduction as you possibly can out of the text.
But don't fill a hole that's
but
there.
But don't
with
go
you
in
want.
there and speculate around something it does not say. All right. We do not add conjecture. We do support implications if there's support for the implication. And we don't fixate on a single feature. There are,
like, where's Zarahemla? Where's Nephi?
There are so many people who dabble in Book of Mormon geography who are so convinced that they have one correlation that is just powerful in their mind, because they've been there, because it just makes all the sense in the world to the way they view the text, and they just hammer on that over and over and over again.
So they have one thing and they try to build the rest of the geography around that one
That's
thing.
That's correct. Whereas what we need to do is account for every single contextualized referent. Now, what do we mean by a contextualized referent? It means that it's in association with other geographic locations.
Yeah.
So there are places where in the Jaredite record, we just have a string of cities listed. There's nothing I can do with that. I can't go north, south, east, west. I can't go up, down. I can't go from east, west. I have no clue where to put that stuff because there's no context behind that particular referent. But if I know that I go from the land of Moron and I then go up somewhere, that gives me something to work with. If I know that I cross over something, if I go east to somewhere, now I've got a way to begin to make this into a map.
Okay.
And so you have to account for every single contextualized referent. Now, John Sorensen drove me nuts because he just simply ignored big parts of the map. And one day, I was just frustrated. I was in his office. I said, John, look at this. You never go here. You can't, and it was this Alma 43, okay? It's exactly where we were just a few minutes ago, where we have all this action taking place in the wilderness south of Manti and the Sidon River, and armies going back and forth across the Sidon on the borders of Manti, but south of it on the wilderness that's almost down to the narrow strip of wilderness. I said, show me where this is on your map. And he says, I never could figure that part out. So I just left it blank. I said, okay. Well, I mean, you got to give a modeler that kind of flexibility because there will be some things they just can't figure out. But when he just punted and he just said, No, it's like certain
Because
parts of
this
the old...
has to be this. Because he was so fixated on the certain aspects that he found that the rest of it became
He was absolutely fixated on the West Wilderness.
on the Western Wilderness.
So he goes in there and he builds his geography around the fact that you've got the Sierra Madre de Chiapas, the Sierra Madre Occidental, which is the mountain range that's right next to the ocean along the coast of Chiapas. And that was such a gorgeous fit in his mind that was the West Wilderness, that everything else had to fit around that because that was his one point of
for sure, like this is it. And I totally get that. That's actually a really important one because we want to be, like when we find something we feel fits, we want, like going through that whole thing with the 1,000-piece puzzle and the multiple 1,000-piece puzzles all mixed together. You find one piece that you're like, I'm sure that this fits. You start putting it together and then you realize, oh, this is from the wrong puzzle. You know what I mean? And that will derail everything else.
That makes sense.
So there are two scores that you have to give a model. Number one is the degree of comprehensiveness it has, whether or not it's truly accounting for all the geographic reference that there are in the text. And the higher scoring models will account for a larger percentage of those reference. And ultimately, you want a model that accounts for 100% of them, where if the text says that there's a place here and it is contextualized, meaning that I have an up, down, north, south, east, west, or day's journey kind of a relationship to it, that I should be able to go locate that somewhere on my map. If we can account for all contextualized reference, then I should get 100% score on my map for that particular part of the scoring. Then the next part comes in where how close of a fit am I to the text, and we'll get to that here in just a minute.
Yeah.
All right, so more assumptions. There are some terms in the text that have multiple meanings. So bountiful has more than one meaning. Zarahemla has more than one meaning. Nephi has more than one meaning. Desolation has more than one meaning. You've got to understand that. And you've got to be able to go into a particular part of the text and know when it's the greater land being talked about, the lesser land being talked about, or the city that's being talked about.
Like, for example, Jerusalem and land of Jerusalem? Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly the idea. Then there are four things that are continental in scope. So when we say continental, we mean from sea to sea. And in the case of the Book of Mormon, it's from the East Sea to the West Sea. And those four things are the land bountiful, because it has, there are certain areas that they're clearly on the East Sea, others are clearly on the West Sea. So bountiful has to go all the way across. It's got to be continental in scope. Then we've got the Greater Zarahemla that has the very same situation, the narrow strip of wilderness, and then the land Nephi down on the south. So you've got to build a model where all four of those go from sea to sea.
It's
and
crazy.
if you come in and if you show me your Nephi and you can't show me where it touches the West Sea and the East Sea, I'm going to call you on it.
Yeah.
Because that's not what the text says. The text explicitly says that the greater land of Nephi was a continental scale entity that went from sea to sea. All right. Then it's important that we
so
know.
much. It's amazing.
There's a lot of detail
Yeah,
here.
it's good.
But does the text deserve this kind of close
Oh, it definitely
reading?
does. It needs.
It absolutely does. And we're not going to solve the problem without thinking clearly about these sorts of things. Now, what about space and time? Did the Nephite nation evolve over time? Duh.
Yeah.
It was a very different entity at 90 BC than it was at 72 BC. 90 BC is when we have Alma 22. And Alma 22 is the ultimate geography section, right? Where we're talking about the narrow strip of wilderness and how
Because that's when
everything fits together.
Alma 22. That's when a lot of the missionaries are going. I'm trying to remember actually what's going on in Alma 22.
Yeah, it's when we have the sons of Mosiah.
Yeah, Sons of Mosiah going out.
They're out there doing.
They're going everywhere, so that's where you get all the cities.
And there's a point there where they're talking about the big king of the Lamanites, and he's sort of describing his territory. And so Mormon takes a little aside there and says, okay, for the next 10 verses or so, I'm going to just tell you what the lay of the land was.
Yeah.
And that's where we get a lot of the information that we need to go by of where things were and so forth. But Alma or Mormon is describing the geopolitical situation in Zarahemla and Nephi at about 90 BC. We then have a very similar passage in Alma 50 So 22 and 50 are parallel in the sense that they both have a great deal of dense geographic information. But Alma 50, we're now Captain Moroni's era. We're now 72 BC. What has changed? Tons.
Yes.
The Nephite nation achieved what we call apogee at 72 BC. This is why Mormon goes in and says, there was never a happier time in all of Lamanite history. And yea, if every man could have been as awesome as Captain Moroni, the very powers of hell would have been destroyed forever. He names his own kid after this guy. Yeah. That's how important Captain Moroni was in Mormon's affairs. And the golden age of the Nephite nation was under Captain Moroni.
What does apogee mean?
It means
people like
greatest extent.
Greatest extent.
It means you hit your high point.
Yeah, that's a climax.
It's a climax. Yeah. So what we're seeing in Alma 50 is the Nephite nation it existed at its high point. It is never ever that big or that good again, ever. It just shrinks from there on in. There's something else that goes on in Alma 50 that is remarkable. And that is that up until Alma 50, we have had every time when we go east and west, east precedes west.
Okay.
So it's clear that the fixation within the Nephite record-keeping tradition is east. We're going east.
Because that's probably where they came. Are you saying that's where they came from? Maybe that's why?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about Mulekites, Jaredites, or Lehites, which direction they came from. But nonetheless, there's this sense of manifest destiny. There's this sense that we have Zarahemla, which is in the center part of the land, and we're going to the east. And we're going to go out there and just.
That's an uncharted land. That's an uncharted land. Yeah.
This is where the frontier is. We're taking stuff to the east.
So and for us, we always say back east in America, right? Back east, because that's where for Europeans, that's where we all came from.
That's
from
correct.
The east. And so you're saying that it switches from them saying, "Hey, we're going to go west," to "Hey, we're going to go east."
In Alma 50, there's a subtle change that happens where every time east and west are in the same verse, east precedes west.
Okay.
After this change in Alma 50, west precedes east.
Always.
Always.
Interesting.
Universally across the text. What that says is that the Nephite nation goes from an eastward orientation to a westward orientation that fast.
Like that.
And from then on, for the rest of the Nephite nation, stuff is happening from the center to the west. And there comes a point where after the war chapters, we never hear of the East Coast ever again.
Interesting.
Because it's totally Lamanite by that time.
Yeah.
It's totally been taken over, and it's no longer under the control of the...
And is there fixation on the west? Does that come from Lamanites? That's their homeland, and they're protecting it at that point? They're fortifying and stuff like that?
The thing that's going on here is you have Nephites and Lamanites competing for the very same territory.
Yeah.
And you have Lamanite infilling. So whenever the Nephites give up the slightest bit of land, the Lamanites are just coming in there and taking it over. I mean, it's exactly what we see in Ukraine and Russia today, where we have this little jousting going on back and forth over territory. So you have to understand that the Nephite nation is a very different entity depending on where in its history it is. How many capitals did the Nephites have? They had 15 different capitals. So they start in the land of first inheritance, and that wasn't really the capital. They were still
just where they're at.
Lehi's
They're all together.
patriarchy. But nonetheless, that was the headquarters of them. And then they go to the city of Nephi. That's their second capital. And then they go up to Zarahemla, which is their third capital. And then eventually they're being kicked out all over the place during the time of Moroni. And they go to Angola, and they go to David, they go to Joshua, they go to Desolation, they go to Teancum, they go to Shem. You add up all those things, and the Nephites had 15 different places, and they changed capitals 20 times. Mm-hmm. So there's a time in the war chapters, for instance, where we have Captain Moroni getting really super ticked at Pahoran.
Yeah.
And he says, "You lazy bum, you're just sitting there in the heart of our land, protected by all this stuff, and you're not sending supplies down to my guys. And all my soldiers out here because Captain Moroni had a two-front war going on. He had a southwestern front and a south central front down where Manti was, where Helaman's doing his action, and then he's got that northeastern front, which is all up and down from Moroni on the south up to the city of Bountiful on the north. And he's trying to protect all this territory, and he's depending on men and material flowing from the central part of Zarahemla, and he's just ripping into Pahoran for not supplying that. Yeah. Pahoran says, dude, I've been kicked out. The kingmen came in, took over Zarahemla, and I'm trying to run this thing as a governor in exile from Gideon, which is across the river east from Zarahemla. So there's another one of the places where the Nephites had their capital for a very short period of time, was actually in the city of Gideon. And you add all that stuff up, and they had 15 different capitals, and they changed capital cities 20 times. That's the essence of the Nephites. Yeah, they were a beleaguered minority who were getting kicked around by a vastly superior force, and it was only by the grace of God that they prevailed in some cases when they were righteous. And they tell you as much. Yeah. Did the Nephites ever outnumber the Lamanites? Never.
Which makes sense because the Nephites were those of the covenant, and we see that later on that it's not necessarily even your lineage. It's those who make covenants with God, right? And so that's always been a minority, no matter in any story throughout the Old Testament, New Testament, and just world history. And then even beyond that, like, because you know a lot of people have talk about the talks of like changes of skin color and things like that in the Book of Mormon. And when you think about it, and my personal take on the changes of skin color isn't God's magically changing skin color or whatever. It's that the Lamanites are similar to how God warns against intermarrying with the Canaanites because they're not of the covenant and will tear them away from the covenant. That's the same thing that's happening with the Lamanites, and because of that, their skin color changes as what happens when you have families with people that are have different skin color, right? And so, like, to me that makes sense because then you have the Lamanites are joining up with a whole other group of people that already exists that is already going to be much greater than whoever is with Nephi and his crew. So that makes tons of sense what you're saying.
Yeah, there's some recent scholarship about this skin color thing, and we've probably been way too simplistic in our analysis and understanding of what is probably going on in the text with that. So yeah, some of the things that you're talking about, where it's probably more of a covenantal kind of a implication, has a lot of merit to it. But anyway, so if you can't go in and tell me where the Nephite nation is at this particular point in time, I'm not going to pay much attention to your geography because it's a vastly different thing. So think what happens as the Book of Helaman starts up. We now have Captain Moroni, who's now gone on to his eternal reward, and his kid, Nephihah, is the new general of the Nephite army. What happens to Nephihah? He's quickly kicked out of all of Zarahemla. Nephihah loses every single square inch. There is no more Nephite control over any part of Zarahemla. The Lamanites own the whole place. The Nephites are Bountiful. So there's another one of those capitals of where they had to go to. They were somewhere in the land Bountiful. And then gradually Nephihah comes back and he reconquers little bits and pieces of what was the former Nephite territory in Zarahemla, but he never gets it all back. And so from that point on, we have Samuel the Lamanite, who's coming in to Zarahemla to preach to the Nephites because he's more righteous than they are. There's this intense intermixing, and then we have all of this migration going up into the land northward, and Nephites are going up there, Lamanites are going up there, Gadiantans are going up there. This is the nature of the landscape that we have to talk about. And so if you're going to show me a map and show me something, you cannot generalize. You cannot just say, well, this is the land of Jershon, and this is what happened to it forever, because there was a time when it was wilderness. There was a time when Captain Moroni goes in there and kicks out the Lamanites out of that east wilderness. There's a time when the anti-Nephi Lehi's go in there and take over Jershon. It's given to them as their inheritance. And Jershon means inherit, by the way, which is a wonderful little play on words that we have. It's a really cool part of the text. But they don't last there for very long, because after the Amalekites come in there and try to go get these guys, and they're scared away under Zarahemla, but because the Nephites have this body armor, the Nephites say, whoa, that was too exposed. We didn't really have the capability to support these guys. We're going to take them down to an area that we can control a bit better, and so they send them down to Melech. And that's where the anti-Nephi Lehis hang out for the rest of the text. As far as we know, they were there It doesn't mention them ever leaving that particular place again. And so if you want to talk about the anti-Nephi Lehis, it's very important that you tell me where they're at.
When, at what time.
At what time period. Otherwise, you're going to get this whole thing mixed up. And you'd be surprised how many people just commit that simple logical flaw of not correlating space and time.
Yeah.
So then it's important to realize the Lamanites infilled former Nephite places almost instantly. So people go in and say, well, in the final battles, Mormon takes the Nephites and they're just abandoning places. So we should see places that are utterly abandoned. No. What you're seeing is the Lamanites are taking over those places about as quickly as they kick the Nephites out. That's this infilling narrative that we see. Then
that never happens in war. Like in war, like for example, Jerusalem. How many times that has been sieged, destroyed, and they fill it in. You know what I mean? It's left abandoned. This amazing city's left abandoned forever.
There's much less abandonment than there is just change of the guard in the Book of Mormon polities. Then we've got a very important concept about sovereignty. Now think of what we do today in the United States, in Western civilization, pretty much in every nation that is able to control its own borders today. We say this is the boundary of the state of Utah, and here's where Utah ends and Arizona starts, and here's where Nevada starts, and we know exactly where these places are, and this part reports to Salt Lake, and this part reports to Phoenix, and this part reports to Reno. Yeah. Okay, what's really going on? Well, that's sovereignty. That's modern sovereignty. That's because we have all the apparatus of very advanced state institutions.
Mapping and we have all the technology to do that.
That does not describe the Nephites and the Lamanites. There was a lot of overlap. There were a lot of places where you can have a Nephite city, and then right next door you can have somebody else who's in there. The Nephites tend to call them Lamanites for everybody who's not them. Yeah. But nonetheless, it could have been people who actually were descendants of Laman and Lemuel, or it could be people who had been there for thousands of years, or it could be whomever else, and they're just right next door. And then you got all this wilderness out there. And so what you really have are strings of settlements. Where did strings of settlements tend to happen? Along rivers. Rivers, of course. Rivers were the lifeblood of the Nephites and Lamanites, just like they have been the lifeblood
humanity.
Of all humans on the planet since Adam and Eve. And so when I went in to build a map, the first thing I did was plot rivers, because I couldn't find a good
river Sidon?
A good river depiction on Google Earth. I saw some things that the meteorologists had put out that showed where some river basins went, but they didn't actually show me where the river flowed. They just showed me kind of where the changes in elevation were. It cost me probably 3,000 or 4,000 hours to go in there and build a river network of Mesoamerica, so I could plot where the rivers flowed to the point where I felt comfortable saying, this is a likely place where a city may exist, or where a site that I see at this particular place could have relevance, and if it goes back to the right time period, that might be a Book of Mormon site because it's right here on this river, or it's the confluence of these two tributaries that come together, that type of thing. Rivers were very important, but the point is that these people did not exercise exclusive sovereignty over their entire territory. So you can't just take a great big area and say, this is the Nephite nation. And because there's little patches in here that they don't control. So we then have people who want to go minimize and marginalize the Nephites. And they want to say, I don't think I would accept any Nephite military action that was more than 100 miles away from where I think they were headquartered. Because I don't think they had the capability of projecting power, maintaining supply lines, actually going out there and projecting force at 200 miles. You'd be surprised how many people think that way. And yet we have evidence that there were much larger scale operations taking place all over the place in many parts of the Americas. And so we make the assumption about the text, the Nephites and Lamanites were not less capable than their contemporaries. That if we can go see that people are actually colonizing 250 miles away, we should assume that the Nephites and Lamanites were capable of that same kind of colonization.
For sure.
If we can see that the Lamanites were capable of projecting power and maintaining supply lines across a front that itself was 150 kilometers in length, why couldn't the Nephites have done the same?
Yes, 100%.
It makes no sense to go in there and limit the Nephites into something that you think is just sort of commonsensical, or that would be historically have some sort of a precedent in your mind, and yet at the very same time acknowledge that these other people are operating at a much larger scale.
Yeah, and we were talking about this a little bit before the interview about how a lot of times I think because we have like this digital world we live in, we have cars, airplanes, all this stuff, we think that we are the most superior in every sense of the word. When I was talking about how much of the time I marvel at the physical mechanical things that we've been able to accomplish as human beings. And, all of the ancient cities that we admire, happened thousands of years ago without the same technologies that we have today. And so limiting them to being like, oh, well, yeah, we can project power, we can travel these distances, we can control borders or do things at these distances, but there's no way they could have. It's kind of silly, especially when you have, like, for example, the Incan network, and I know it's not necessarily fits perfectly with Book of Mormon times, but the Incan network of sending messages where they'd have these runners that would sprint, the Choskees, and they'd sprint and they'd be able to pass messages hundreds of miles in a day. And so you have to
not just messages.
Not just messages,
They could
but
take
actual
fresh fish
stuff.
from the Pacific, and they could put that on the Inca's plate in Cusco, and it was still fresh.
And it's amazing. So I think that's a very important thing to do. Is we can't think of them as primitive idiots that can only have their little town and nothing else, right?
Well, and especially when their contemporaries are clearly capable of more. Yeah. All right. Then the other important assumption about the text is that there are still landmarks that are viable after the destruction. You can't go in there and say, the destruction talked about in 3rd Nephi changed everything to such an extent that we can no longer recognize the place after the destruction. So we've got to kind of wipe the slate clean and start fresh. No. There's localized destruction. We have what we think is probably volcanism. We have what we think is very clearly seismic activity with earthquakes. There appear to be tidal waves. There seem to be hurricane kinds of things happening, but the destruction is fairly localized. So we have mudslides, and we have a city that is covered over by water. That kind of thing is taking place. But we're not seeing this vast continental scale of destruction that changes coastlines or anything else. All right, we already talked about some of the important things that we learned from this particular version of the text, and you got to take that into account. But notice about what happens from early modern English, okay? Interesting things. So for instance, up and down mean elevation, and north, south, east, and west are cardinally directional. And this has been an object of some discussion over the years, especially with the Sorensen model, because in order to make his model work, John Sorensen had to skew the compass. There are support for that almost doesn't exist anymore, because
we know that the ancients understood the cardinal directions.
The cardinal directions ruled in antiquity throughout all of the range that John is trying to locate the text. So that's not very few people pay much attention to that anymore. But it's still an issue. And early modern English is very clear. North, south, east, and west are the cardinal directions, just like what we'd expect. Now, here's an important one. If there's one piece of the geographic puzzle that has been used more than anything else to try to go find a place to book more, it's the narrow neck of land. Guess what early modern English tells us about the narrow neck of land?
What's that?
It's a peninsula. It's not an isthmus.
Interesting.
Now think of the implications of that.
Big implications.
Huge. If the narrow neck of land is a peninsula, it means I only have to have one sea. And I do. The text of the Book of Mormon only talks about one sea in association with the narrow neck of land. It's the West Sea. It's always the West Sea.
So this is the question though. So the narrow neck of land doesn't lead from the land south to the land north.
No, it does. It leads into.
Okay.
It's one of the ways you can get there.
Okay, so
But
you
it's
would have
not
to
the
get there.
exclusive way to get there.
Yeah, so you would have to get there. So if it's a peninsula, you'd have to eventually cross water at some point. Correct? Is that what you're saying? Because that's what a peninsula is, right?
A peninsula has one connection or perhaps a couple of connections to land, but it's essentially a strip of land that juts out from a coastline.
Out from the coastline. So my question is, how would it go to the land north? How would it be the place from the land south to the land north if it's a peninsula that just juts out into the ocean?
If it's a long, skinny peninsula, it can be a communication route, just like a road could be today. And I can show you a number of instances of how that works.
But there's no connection to another land.
Oh, there is.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So
and you could even have a peninsula that has multiple connections to land. I mean, those exist because you've got lakes, you've got inland waterways, you've got marshlands, you've got estuaries, you've got lagoons, and that type of thing.
Yeah, I'm just having a hard time visually seeing it, but we'll have to see it.
But anyway, this is a very significant concept. In early modern English, the vast majority of necks of land are peninsulae. They are not isthmi. And yet, how many people for the last 200 years have been looking for salt water on the east, salt water on the west, or on the north and south, or wherever it is you're trying to find this thing, and we're looking for an isthmus. And 99% of the models have been built around that concept. And that's not where early modern English takes us at all. So if the narrow neck of land is a peninsula, all bets are off. Most of the models that we've been following up to this point need to be retooled. Now, there are some very, very bright people who picked up on this, okay? We're not the first people by far. Gareth Lowe, who was John Sorensen's mentor, he was the archaeologist on the ground down in Chiapas, feeding archaeological reports back to John, the other at BYU. He picked up on this. He said, it's got to be a peninsula. It's got to be this little sandbar that goes right along the coast of Chiapas, right here. Then another clue is the fact that it's got to be narrow. And early modern English tells us very much what is narrow. It's length greatly exceeding width. So back in that era, something was narrow if it looked like a shoelace.
And isn't there also something where it talks about how it has to be a day's journey from east to west?
Well, that's a whole different issue of distance. But we'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, if something has got to be long and skinny, that tells us what kind of a peninsula we're looking for. And so many of these people have sort of a square boxy-like peninsula, or some kind of a space in between certain bodies of water and so forth. That's not what narrow means at all in early modern English. We then have something that is very interesting, and that is the word between. So you and I, in modern English, think we know what between means. It's kind of a no-brainer. We think lehi sits between Provo and Salt Lake. That is not how the Book of Mormon uses the word between. Interesting. The Book of Mormon, in this text, always uses the early modern English version of the word between, which is that you have something off to the side of a different nature by two twins.
So what would that look like here?
It would look like the Jordan River is between Provo and Salt Lake. Because the Jordan River is something of a very different nature. It's not a city. It's not like Provo, it's not like Salt Lake, but it's by Provo, it's by Salt Lake. So it's a thing off to the side of a very different nature by two twins. So the twins are Provo and Salt Lake because they're two cities along the Wasatch Front.
And the Jordan River.
In early modern English, between meant by a pair of twins, by twin or by twain. That's where this thing is coming from. So that's what it meant in Shakespeare's time, and that's what we see throughout the Book of Mormon. So we see peace between the Nephites and the Lamanites, okay? Pieces of a different nature off to the side. Nephites and Lamanites are the twins. And that's the pattern that we see. And the word
probably
between
changes a lot of things then.
It changes a ton of things. The word between appears dozens of times in the text, but it appears one very important time where it's talking about the narrow neck of land is between the land northward and the land southward. So it has to be something that is physically quite different from the land northward and the land southward. But it's near them, and the land northward and southward are the analogs. They are the twins. They're the things that are comparable. But then this other thing is of a different nature.
So it doesn't
by them.
Okay, so that explains everything that I was saying, my confusion with it being a peninsula, but also leading between the north-south.
It's
it doesn't have
a
to.
route of communication.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be the whole route. The only way to there is just somewhere near the land north and south.
But so many modelers have assumed it was an isthmus, and therefore they said the lehi explorers, when they leave the city of Nephi and they go to where the Jaredites were destroyed, they must have passed through the isthmus without even knowing they'd gone through it.
Okay.
Because they're assuming an isthmus, okay?
Yeah.
If the narrow neck of land is not an isthmus, but it's a peninsula along the west coast, which is what the text
that is by
is
twain,
talking about.
the north and land south.
It's by the twain of the land northward and the land southward. You can have the lehi explorers who just went from the land northward to the land southward, may or may not have gone along the narrow neck of land, but they got into the land northward, and then they get back to the city of Nephi, and they did not necessarily have to pass through the isthmus, because there was no isthmus. There was a peninsula along the west coast. Furthermore, the narrow pass and the narrow passage, which are also ways to get from the land southward to the land northward, could be just different routes, different methods, because you can have many ways to get from point A to point B, right here. And so this opens up a whole new vista in Book of Mormon scholarship.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm thinking about it.
And that's why we were able to solve the problem with the Lamanite consensus model, and that's why we've been able to come up with a model now that has a 100% degree of fit to the text, because it follows this rule, because it's literally using the early modern English version of what it means to be between.
Well, let's see this.
Have we gone through the whole methodology?
No, there's still more stuff out here.
Oh my God!
Here's what I want to spend some time with.
Okay. There's so much. Can we link to this? Can we share? Will you share this with us so people can read through? Okay.
Sure.
We're gonna link to everything because we just barely skipped a few slides. We're gonna talk about this. And then we're going to get into your model. That's probably going to be a part 2 because I don't think anyone's going to watch 5 hours
there's
straight.
no way to do justice to this.
No. And it needs to be done well.
But there was one thing I wanted to show, okay?
And I'm interested in this, Sidon.
How the Sidon flows north. Because this is a key interpretation that flows from the methodology. If everything we're doing is correct, and we have the right assumptions about the text, we're interpreting the text appropriately based on those assumptions, then Sidon had to flow from south to north. Absolutely had to. And that changes several people's models.
Because how many rivers run south to north?
Very few.
Very few. Yeah.
And so that means that we have a very limited scope of areas where we can go place the Book of Mormon successfully. So how do we know that the Sidon flowed from south to north? There are 5 places in the text that tell us that. And this changes so much that I thought it would be a useful example of how to follow the methodology to come to some sort of a conclusion about a real-world location.
Okay, let's break it down.
All right.
Pass out the Book of Mormon. Can you hand us the other ones?
Here you go.
We'll follow along with you.
You guys use Dave Rosenball's. And you can even use the LDS 1981 if you want. Okay, so we go to Alma 17:1.
It's like a scripture chase back in seminary.
Okay. Alma 17:1 tells us that Manti is south of Zarahemla.
And now it came to pass that as Alma was journeying from the land Gideon southward away to the land of Manti, behold, to his astonishment, he met with the sons of Mosiah journeying towards the land of Zarahemla. So there, he's crossing them. They seem like they're going north towards the land of Zarahemla.
Here's what is interesting about this passage. Before Manti gets established, what happens when people travel from between Nephi and Zarahemla? They get lost. Everybody's getting lost.
Okay.
We then get Manti established, and not only do we have people no longer getting lost, there's no more mention of what we call the disorientation narrative.
Yeah.
But it is such a standardized path that a guy going north and a guy going south will meet on the trail.
Yes. Okay.
There's literally
It's like a highway.
It's like a highway, okay? Things have become systematized in the Nephite nation by this point. But nonetheless, the key point here is Manti is south of
The land there.
of Zarahemla, okay? Now, we go to Alma 22:27, and here we learn that the narrow strip of wilderness separates Nephi from Zarahemla. So we're talking about verse 27. And there was a narrow strip of wilderness which ran from the sea east to the sea west, and borders on the wilderness on the north by the land of Zarahemla through the borders of Manti, and thus were the Lamanites and the Nephites divided. So the narrow strip of wilderness divides the Nephites on the north from the Lamanites on the south. And we've got the land of Nephi to the south, the land of Zarahemla to the north, and that's what the narrow strip of wilderness is all about. Is it's a physical line of demarcation that is consistent throughout the entire history. So even when the Lamanites totally own Zarahemla, they still talk about the line between the Nephites and the Lamanites. Okay, so there's this narrow strip of wilderness, and it divides the south from the north. Now the head of Sidon is very close to the narrow strip of wilderness. We learn that right here as well, where it says
Right here, north by the land of Zarahemla, through the borders of Manti, by the head of the river Sidon, run from east towards the west.
So it's the narrow strip of wilderness running from the east towards the west, and the head of Sidon is right there by this narrow strip of wilderness.
Okay.
All right, so the head of Sidon has got to be the beginning or the source or the place where Sidon starts.
And so Sidon only exists in the land southward. It doesn't exist in the land.
Sidon only exists in the land southward, and it only exists in the land of Zarahemla, north of the narrow strip of wilderness.
Okay.
Because this is this narrow strip of wilderness that separates Zarahemla on the north from Nephi on the south.
Well, so I thought the river Sidon was first discovered by the Muleks and named by the Mulekites.
It was.
And weren't they in the land northward?
Well, they start in the land northward. In fact,
But they meet them in, that's where they
But
meet.
what the text says is that after they went to they made landfall in the land northward, they then went into the land southward, and that's where they colonized and settled.
Okay.
And they go up. In fact, that's one of the proofs of where the Sidon comes from, because the text says that the Mulekites went up,
So there has
and they're going south from the ocean because they're going to the land southward.
Okay.
And so they're going south and they're going up.
Okay.
And that shows you that the Sidon is flowing to the north downhill.
Okay.
But anyway, the Mulekites founded Zarahemla on the west coast of the river Sidon. And there's a whole other talk we could go into about what would that likely have been.
Yeah.
Because the Mulekites were almost certainly on a Phoenician ship. And the Phoenicians, we know quite a bit about where they settled.
Yeah.
Because they settled a great deal of the entire Mediterranean basin. And they were never more than 40 miles from the ocean, ever. And so the Phoenicians always tried to be seafaring to a large extent. So their settlements were on rivers big enough to support ocean-going vessels. So that's exactly where we'd expect to find Zarahemla today. Not too far from the ocean, west of a big river that's navigable by ocean-going vessels out to get into that sea where they.
So you think that the river Sidon has to be able to flow in, like it flows into the ocean and is big enough that the seagoing vessels could have traveled up it?
Well, any river.
Any river goes to the ocean.
Is going to end up in the ocean eventually.
So but that it would be north, like that entrance into the ocean would be in the north.
The
northern part
mouth
the
of
river,
the
right?
Sidon has to be in the north.
Has to be in the north.
Because it's starting in the south.
Okay. Now I understand.
Okay, so we then go down through, and the borders of Manti are by the narrow strip of wilderness. The land of Manti is by the head of Sidon. And you go from the head of Sidon down to Zarahemla. So look what happens over here in Alma 56:25. So Alma 56:25 says,
It says, neither durst they march down against the city of Zarahemla, neither durst they cross the head of Sidon over the city of Nephi.
So from the head of Sidon to Zarahemla, what direction is it? It's down. From the head of Sidon to Zarahemla, what? Or rather, the elevation is down. The direction is north.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this is one of the ways that we know that the Sidon flowed north. But that's only one of 5. There's now 4 more ways. And so we can go in here and we can show how the Zarahemla is right on the border of Sidon. It's right to the west of Sidon. To go from Zarahemla to Nephi, you have to go up. And Nephi and the narrow strip of wilderness where the Sidon begins is north of Nephi.
Okay.
And so that tells us that going towards the north, I'm going up. And that key line is in Alma 224. So you go over here to Alma 224.
Behold, we follow the camp of Amalekites, and to their great astonishment in the land of Minyan, or whatever, Minon, above the land of Zarahemla, in the course of the land Nephi. We saw a numerous host of the Lamanites and joined the Amalekites, and behold, the Amalekites have joined them.
And see, this is a place where in the Royal Scouts' critical text it says Amalekites.
Amalekites, yeah.
The Amalekites. But anyway, here is the key thing, that we're going up because Minon is above Jerusalem. So to go is above Zarahemla. So to go from Zarahemla to Minon, which is south, we're going up.
Okay.
And that shows us that the Sidon River at that particular point has got to be flowing northward. Because it's got to be going downhill towards the north. All right, that's the second of 5. All right, now the third of 5. And that's the one we were talking about just a minute ago. So the Mulekites first make landfall in the land northward. Alma 22 tells us that, verse 30. Then they found their capital in the land southward. But to get there, they go along the Sidon River because Zarahemla is right on the Sidon. It's immediately west of Sidon. We then have the Mulekites in Alma 22:31. Here's the key verse, okay? So Alma chapter 22, verse 31 says, and they came from there, meaning the seacoast, up into the south wilderness. 22 verse 31.
Up into the south
wilderness. Okay. So the Mulekites themselves on their
elevation.
This is their second their second landing now. They're going up, but they're going south.
So that's the importance of this is where you kind of see the importance of understanding that up is elevation, not north.
That's
down
correct.
Is elevation, not south, and that the cardinal directions really are the cardinal directions, and that's how you really get the idea.
You cannot make sense of this stuff if you don't understand those assumptions to begin with, and they've got to be the same. They've got to be consistent with what's on the old world.
And it is consistent with the old world.
We've got to see the text behaving the very same way in the old world as it is now in the new. But using that consistency, we can figure this stuff out.
Yeah. Okay.
So anyway, that's the third of the 5 places in the text where it shows us that the river Sidon has to flow north. All right, here's the fourth. So we're now in, it's all in Alma 16:6. This is a very interesting verse. So this is preceding Captain Moroni. And we have the Zoram, who's the chief captain over the Nephite armies. And Zoram consults with Alma and says, where should I go to intercept the Lamanites? And Alma tells him, here's where to go. Here's where they're going to be. And so verse 6. So the Lamanites will cross the river Sidon in the south wilderness, away up beyond the borders of the land of Manti. So there's a wilderness south of Manti. And it's up. And they're going to meet him on the east of the river Sidon, and there the Lord will deliver into thy hands everybody who's been taken captive by the Lamanites. And he does exactly that, and there are no Nephites lost in this encounter. They're able to recover all their prisoners of war, and they take them all back home. But here's the key point. So the wilderness is south of Manti. the wilderness is beyond the borders of Manti, and the wilderness is up from Manti. So from Manti, you're going upriver towards the south, and you're going upstream. That says that at that particular point, south of Manti, the river is flowing towards the north. It's going downhill towards the north. All right, we then go to number 5, and that's in Alma 4332. And you have Captain Moroni now, who has his people in exactly the same place that Zoram had his people earlier in 1606, where you've got this area in south of the borders of Manti. And look where they're going, down into the borders of the land of Manti. So from the wilderness south of Manti to the borders of the land of Manti, it is a down relationship. And that tells you that at that particular point, south of Manti, the river Sidon is flowing northward downhill. So those are the 5 places in the text where we know
that changes a lot of things, because that gets rid of most rivers that exist.
Most of the rivers on Earth do not qualify.
Is the river Sidon in the North American model the Mississippi?
Yes.
Yeah, which goes north to south.
And see, it's the people that are trying to make the Mississippi work who commit that logical fallacy I told you about earlier of the forced reading in Alma 43, where they try to link Jershon with Manti, when there's all that stuff in between that makes that not work. And the whole purpose is because that's the only place that they can figure out that tries to support their model of a south-flowing river. But these 5 places show it was always a north-flowing river. And here's why that's important. Because it's been generally understood since the time of Orson Pratt that the Sidon flowed north. So go into that book, go to the topical guide at the back. This is the 1981 edition.
And look up Sidon.
But it still had the same notes that had been there ever since the time of Orson Pratt. They'd changed a few of them, but modernized a little bit of it.
Sidon.
We go to Sidon. And notice what we published in the Book of Mormon for over 100 years.
Sidon River. Most prominent river in Nephite territory runs north to the sea.
That is such a well-established notion that in 1992, when the Encyclopedia of Mormonism gets published, John Clark, who's one of our very best archaeologists, an absolutely amazing, brilliant guy. I love to read in the literature and see John E. Clark, cited, because that's one of our very best. And he's cited a lot because he's a prolific scholar. Anyway, John Clark authored the article in the Encyclopedia of Mormonism on Book of Mormon geography. And he says, this is one of the few unambiguously attested notions from the text that the river Sidon flowed north. So what would I ask of a Wayne May and a John Lefgren and a Jonathan Neville and a Boyd Tuttle and a Ryan Nielsen? I'd say, show me from the text how the Mississippi could possibly be the Sidon. It doesn't work.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, for sure. It's really I've never gone like, and like I said, we're gonna share all of these notes so you guys can look at the verses yourselves and check it out and kind of make the decision for yourself. But this is really good. The 5 different, and there's like 7 different scriptures that for each of these things that you're talking about. So yeah.
And then people come in and say, well, maybe up doesn't mean elevation.
But it does.
Go to Alma 43:34. Go see what it says.
I'm going.
Alma 43:34.
40.
And it came to pass that the Lamanites came up on the north of the hill, where a part of the army of Moroni was concealed. So I mean, it's not saying up. Yeah, it's. So what? It came up,
going up
on
the north of the hill.
Up on
They're going
north.
up on the hill.
Yeah, so it's showing elevation and.
So,
and
what does the word up
cardinal
mean
directions.
in a spatial context
Yeah.
in this text?
Because they're not saying north on a hill.
No.
Yeah. Makes sense. And we just know that because you read the New Testament, and every single time they're going to Jerusalem, they're going up.
That's
every single
correct.
time they're going away from Jerusalem, they're going down.
We did
an episode on this when it comes to Lehi's land of inheritance.
Absolutely.
And so you have to. I believe that systematic error cannot be made if you're going to get a good geographic model.
So think of what we've just done. We have created a way to think about the Book of Mormon where you start with your worldview. And if your worldview is Joseph Smith's infallible, you'll come to a different conclusion. But if your worldview is the text of the Book of Mormon is the most divine thing I'm likely to hold in my hand in my lifetime, and these words are the words of God, and there was a tight translation process that brought them to me in early modern English, and one of the virtues of early modern English is that it is less ambiguous than modern English, so that I can understand what's happening here. Then with these assumptions about the text and with interpretive apparatus I build on top of those assumptions so that I go in and I apply those assumptions and say, okay, this yea clause, this is what it's talking about because this explicates the previous clause. It's not talking about a brand new thing, it's talking about what that previous clause itself was talking about. It's the same subject of both clauses. And I go through and I just naturally follow that through, and I begin to use the lexical resource of the Oxford English Dictionary to go in there and see what happens with a particular phrase. And we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of that because there's a lot more where that came from. But we did talk about that for a little bit with the word between and so forth. And then we go...
what does betwixt mean?
Well, betwixt is very interesting because it has... there are 3 times in the text where it's used exactly like between. But there are 3 times in the text where it has a different relationship. And... if you go to my blog is called Book of Mormon Resources. Okay. I've been blogging since 2011. Nice. There are over 380 articles out there now, about 60% of which have to do with Book of Mormon geography. There's a few in there that have to do with other stuff I'm interested in. But the vast majority of this stuff is Book of Mormon geography related. And it's well enough documented that it appears in academia.edu hundreds of times. It's a well-cited source by lots of people. But in there is an article called Between Things. Between Things. Okay. And that tells you, at the end of that article, I show you what the 6 instances of betwixt and how they fit the pattern.
Okay. We'll link it in the description.
And betwixt is a little different than the word between.
Okay, cool. Wow.
But anyway, what have we done? We've simply paid attention to the text. Have we talked about archaeology? Not one time. Man. Have we gone in here and actually gone into some historical sources? Not a single time. We've never left the text. But we've created a world around this text because of close reading, because of paying attention to every little word, because of hanging on the nature of these relationships, because of going deep, because of actually feasting on these words. We've created a relationship here where we can now begin to make sense of the spatial relationships that are out here. And then what we did was we said, across all of the modelers, there's only a handful of relationships they all agree upon. Ups and downs they agree upon. Those are relevant, those are significant. North, south, east, west, they agree upon that. We have to take those into account. The day's journeys, we have to deal with that. And the crossovers, that's also significant and relevant. Yeah. So we said, okay, let's limit it to that. And we went in and we found every occurrence because one of our assumptions is we have to take every contextualized reference.
Do you have like an Excel sheet or something that you kept all these in? Oh my gosh,
now
I
we're
need
talking,
to see this
okay?
Excel sheet.
Now we're talking. When I can get Book of Mormon geography to Excel rather than Word, now we're cooking with gas.
Yeah, there we go.
Now we have something we can start hanging our hat on. And that Excel spreadsheet had to go to 21 different versions. And I had to go get a engineer on board, a fellow named Layton from
Layton?
No, he's from South Salt Lake, kind of the Cottonwood area. But I mean, very, very smart guy. He's a financial analyst. But he had to help us on that
Excel
model,
sheet,
on that Excel spreadsheet, because it began to exceed my capacity on Excel. But after 21 editions, I have the ability to audit a model in an Excel spreadsheet and come up with a score. And there are 229 different relationships. If you take every place where there's an up, a down, a north, a south, east, a west, a day's journey, or a crossover, there are 200, those appear 229 times in the text. Now, suppose you could come up with a model
It matches
that
all.
matches all 229 of those relationships. Should we pay attention to that model?
Did you do it?
Yes, of course we did.
Oh, shoot.
I wouldn't be telling you about this if I hadn't done it.
This is gonna be buck wild.
That is the Lamanite consensus model.
And we are going to have to get into that during part 2 of our interview with Kirk Magleby. But this has been so informative. I think this is really important. And one thing that I want to do, and maybe you already have done it, but I want every single person that has a geographic model, I want them to, I feel like this is really comprehensive. It seems like it follows a scientific method very well, and it seems to cover all the bases, at least that I can think of. And I think it's important that anyone who has a geographic model puts it to the test in this way. And I'd love to see that happen, to see a battle of the geographic models in this sort of way.
Well, if the two of you with as much vim and vigor as you have are willing to take this on as a project, we can make it happen.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
But it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of interviews and a lot of going out there and working with people.
For sure.
Because as I indicated, by the time you've gone to exerted the mental energy to create a model, you're invested in
That
it.
is your baby.
And here's the thing.
And that's why
I think
worldviews are so important, because
Yes.
it comes to the end of the day that I can go show you from the Word of God what the text says, and you're going to argue with me.
Yeah, and I think this is where we can be relevant, because we're young guys. You have 50 years of experience. The Wayne Mays, everyone who's in this space, they've been pouring their heart and soul into it, right? And they're creating that whole worldview thing. We all have these different worldviews. We're pretty fresh. We're pretty fresh at all of this, and we're curious as can be on all of it. And so I think that maybe that's where we can play a role, is maybe we should never come up with our own model. Maybe that's not our job, is to come up with the model.
Dude, after hearing all that, I'm not worthy to dip my toe into that.
But and we'll start railroading our thoughts into whatever worldview. And so maybe that's where we can play a role in this whole thing, is by saying we're not going to try to come up with a geographic model. We want to have an objective way to weigh the models, and I think that what you've come up with is pretty good, a really good start.
Okay, can I show you one more thing? That's
One
really
more
cool?
thing.
One more thing.
Yeah, we'll have to figure out how we're going to break this up later. So
Yeah.
don't
I
even worry
was
about it.
prepared to show you 34 reasons why Mesoamerica must be the place where the Book of Mormon took place. Okay, but I'm going to show you one.
Okay, show us one. Put your hat on, though. You have to put on your hat.
First of all, I'm going to put on a different T-shirt.
Okay, all right, different T-shirt.
Okay,
Poor
I'm going to
Shannon's.
put on the T-shirt of the church.
Okay, there we go.
This is the church's logo.
Do they sell that on LDS.org?
No. In fact, they probably aren't
probably
really
get mad at
excited
you.
that somebody has ripped them off.
You're gonna get
But
Kurt
you're gonna
McConkie reaching out to you.
You go to places like Etsy, you go to places like eBay, and you're going to find all kinds of stuff. Yeah, my son got these for me for
Oh
Christmas.
yeah, that's awesome.
All right. So what I'm about to share with you comes not from me, it comes from Mark Wright, who's
Okay.
a wonderful scholar of Mayan and Mesoamerican history, studied under Carl
Let's
Talbot.
sit down because your head's
you
cut
see-
off
whoops.
right now.
He studied under Carl Talbot at UC Riverside. And Mark has undergone serious health challenges for the last several years. But we got him back at the fair conference last week a little bit, and God bless, we hope he continues on his path of recovery. But in his Axis Mundi article, he shares the following. Jesus Christ, who comes to the Americas, showed himself after the resurrection to a number of people in the old world. And as he did so, he said, "Handle me and see that it's me. Touch my hands." He starts with the hands, right? He says, "And thrust your hand in my side." And this appears more than once in the New Testament, where it starts with the hands and then goes to the side. Why would the hands be the way that people would recognize a resurrected person who was crucified in the old world. It's because they were familiar with the Roman method of execution, okay? Look what happens when Jesus Christ comes to the new world. Let's go to 3 Nephi 11.
Best chapter in the whole Book of Mormon.
Oh,
in my
just
opinion.
so incredibly dense. So we go to 3 Nephi 11, and we go down to verse 14. Look what it says.
Arise and come forth unto me, that ye may thrust your hands into my side, and also that ye may feel the prints of the nails in my hands and in my feet. So he switches.
He switches this around for his New World audience. Why?
I have no idea. I've never really even noticed
Because Jesus Christ wants them to understand, I was once dead, but I have now risen from the dead. I'm now alive again. But I was crucified. I was sacrificed. In the new world, the way you sacrifice somebody is you splay the body over a sacrificial altar, you go in under the ribs, and you extract their heart.
So the nails in the hands, because they don't crucify people there. It doesn't make any sense.
So this is not going to convince a New World audience that I've arisen from the dead, but this will.
Yeah.
And that's why in the church's logo we have the signs here and we have the signs here, and it's a glorious, beautiful thing. And this is why Jesus Christ is the Lord of all the earth. And he says that right in 3 Nephi 11. He says, yea, I am the Lord of all the earth. And this is one way we know it.
That's beautiful.
Isn't that beautiful?
That is beautiful. And I'm excited to hear the other 35 that you have. So 33. I appreciate it, Kirk.
Right.
This has been amazing. And thank you guys for watching. Follow Scripture Central. All of their things that they're doing. They've done amazing work, especially when it comes to the academic work that's been done, the thousands of articles that exist, and we appreciate the time that you spent. Please subscribe, share this with people, and please do your own research. Dig into what you believe, where you believe the Book of Mormon happened, because it's going to be in the pages of this book. It's not going to be on this video. It's not going to be anything that Scripture Central has written. It's going to be in the pages of this book, where you're going to find out that Jesus is the Christ, that the Book of Mormon is a historical record, and we wish you luck on your journey. Oh man, I think we're going to have to schedule another one to do the model.